Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr.X Files. If you're new here, this is the place where we dive into the mysteries that keep you up at night. Whether you're here to relax, fall asleep, or spiral into an existential crisis at 3 in the morning, you're in the right place. Drop a comment, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And yeah, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Alright, let's get into it. Tonight, we're talking about something that's fascinated people for centuries. A lost civilization, a city swallowed by the ocean, a place that some say could change everything we think we know about human history. This is the story of Atlantis. But here's the thing, Atlantis isn't just a bedtime story for history buffs or a fantasy reserved for adventure movies. Some people believe it was real, and more than that, they believe someone, somewhere, wants it to stay buried. Because if Atlantis truly existed, and if the people who lived there had technology far beyond our own, what would that mean for us? What if they had discovered how to harness energy in ways we can't even comprehend? What if they had found cures for diseases we still struggle with? What if they understood the universe in ways we're only beginning to scratch the surface of today? It's a thrilling thought, but it's also terrifying. Because if that knowledge existed once, why don't we have it now? For those who believe in the conspiracy, the answer is simple. We were never meant to. They say powerful groups, whether governments, secret societies, or the wealthy elite, have worked tirelessly to keep Atlantis hidden. Because if we found it, the consequences would be earth-shattering. Imagine what would happen if we suddenly uncovered proof of an ancient energy source that could make oil and gas obsolete. Entire industries would collapse overnight. Political structures would be torn apart. And what if we realized that everything we've been taught about human history was wrong? That we are not the pinnacle of civilization, but merely the survivors of something greater that came before us and was wiped out in an instant. The fact that no one has ever conclusively found Atlantis only fuels the fire. To the skeptics, it's proof that it was never real to begin with. To the believers, it's proof that someone, somewhere, doesn't want us looking too closely. So, where did this story begin? The first written account of Atlantis comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, who around 360 BC wrote about a vast, powerful civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time. He described Atlantis as an empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the area we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar. According to Plato, Atlantis was a utopia of wealth, knowledge, and power. Its people were advanced in ways no other culture of the time could match. But then, something happened. The Atlanteans, once wise and noble, became arrogant, corrupt. They defied the gods, and in response, the gods wiped them from the face of the earth. In a single day and night, Atlantis was swallowed by the ocean, its secrets lost forever. For centuries, most scholars dismissed Plato's account as nothing more than a moral lesson, a metaphor about the dangers of hubris. But over time, something changed. People started to wonder, what if Plato wasn't making this up? What if Atlantis was real? And what if it was more than just a city? What if it was a warning? Over the years, theories about the location of Atlantis have emerged like waves crashing on the shore. Some believe it was Santorini, a Greek island devastated by a volcanic eruption around 1600 BC, wiping out the Minoan civilization almost overnight. Others have pointed to the waters off the coast of Spain, where strange underwater structures hint at something ancient lurking beneath the waves. Some even believe Atlantis could be buried beneath the ice of Antarctica, frozen in time, waiting to be uncovered. But what if it's not just the location that's being hidden? What if the truth about Atlantis is something much bigger? Something too dangerous to be revealed? Because here's the thing about secrets. The most powerful ones aren't just lost. They're buried. And someone always has a reason for keeping them that way. Sahara Desert, where a peculiar ring-like formation known as the Rishat structure, or the Eye of the Sahara, lies in eerie solitude. To some, it's just an unusual geological anomaly. To others, it's a tantalizing clue, a remnant of something lost, perhaps even the legendary Atlantis. For centuries, scholars and storytellers alike have been entranced by the myth of Atlantis. But it was never just a city. It was a parable, a warning woven into the fabric of human history. Plato's account wasn't merely about an advanced civilization. It was a tale of unbridled ambition, unchecked power, and the inevitable reckoning that follows. According to ancient legend, Atlantis was a divine creation, a paradise sculpted by Poseidon himself. He had carved the land for his mortal lover, a woman whose name was lost to time. From their union came 10 kings, each ruling over a separate kingdom, a dynasty that was once wise and just. But time has a way of eroding even the strongest foundations. What began as a utopia slowly twisted into something darker. Greed crept in. Arrogance festered. The Atlanteans, once guided by the virtues of balance and respect for nature, sought domination instead, and the gods noticed. The myth tells that Zeus, enraged by their corruption, convened a divine council. The verdict was swift and merciless. In a single night, Atlantis was swallowed whole. Earthquakes raged, waves devoured, and an entire civilization was wiped from existence, as if it had never been. But Atlantis was more than a lost city. It was a reflection of humanity's own cycle of rise and fall. Tales of doomed civilizations stretch across cultures and epochs, echoing the same haunting lesson. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a great flood, a divine reckoning eerily similar to Atlantis's fate. In Hindu mythology, the ancient city of Dwarka was said to have been submerged after a celestial war. And of course, there is the biblical flood, Noah's desperate ark braving the wrath of a vengeful deity. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Atlantis myth is not the city itself, but what it represents. An advanced world, teetering on the edge of its own downfall. Some mystics claim that the Atlanteans weren't just technologically superior, but spiritually evolved as well. Stories speak of beings who had unlocked the secrets of consciousness, who wielded energies beyond human understanding. Some even whispered of immortality. But with knowledge comes danger, and with power comes decay. The fall of Atlantis wasn't just about a lost civilization. It was about humanity's greatest fear, that our ambition, our hunger for control, will one day lead to our own undoing. It's a story that repeats itself, time and time again. Perhaps Atlantis was never meant to be found. Perhaps its true legacy is the warning it left behind. Atlantis is both a dream of humanity's greatest strengths and a nightmare of its deepest flaws. It is the story of a paradise lost, a cautionary tale warning of the dangers of unchecked power, arrogance, and moral decay. What makes Atlantis so enduring is not just its mystery, but its reflection of timeless human themes. Whether it was a real place or a myth, Atlantis exists in our collective imagination as both a symbol of what we could achieve and a warning of how easily it could all crumble. But the biggest question isn't just where Atlantis is buried, it's what might be hidden there. According to some theories, Atlantis was not just an advanced civilization, it was centuries ahead of its time, possessing technology that would seem almost magical to us today. The most radical claim, the Atlanteans, had discovered an unlimited energy source, harnessed through massive crystalline structures that channeled power across their city. Some believe these crystals fueled everything from transportation to weaponry, creating a utopian world free from energy scarcity. Others speculate that Atlanteans had already mastered flight, advanced medicine, and agricultural techniques far beyond our understanding. If even a fraction of this were true, such discoveries would change the world as we know it. And maybe that's exactly why some believe powerful entities don't want Atlantis to be found. This is where the conspiracy deepens. If Atlantis truly had knowledge capable of upending modern industries, who would stand to lose the most? Some argue that powerful governments, corporations, and even religious institutions have been actively suppressing the truth. Imagine what would happen if an ancient, sustainable energy source were uncovered. one that could replace fossil fuels overnight. The oil and gas industry, worth trillions, would collapse. Economies would be thrown into chaos. It's no surprise that some theorists believe that major energy companies would do anything, to keep such knowledge buried. But it doesn't stop there. Some conspiracy theorists point to the Vatican, an institution known for safeguarding ancient texts and artifacts. For centuries, the Church has locked away knowledge deemed too dangerous for public consumption. What if, hidden deep within its archives, there were documents detailing Atlantis' history, blueprints for its lost technology? If such knowledge came to light, it wouldn't just disrupt energy markets. It could challenge our entire understanding of human history, evolution, and civilization itself. And then, there's the most controversial theory of all: aliens. Some believe that the Atlanteans were either in contact with extraterrestrials or were extraterrestrial themselves. The idea ties into the broader ancient astronaut hypothesis, the belief that beings from beyond Earth have guided human civilization for millennia. Ancient myths from around the world speak of gods descending from the sky, bestowing knowledge upon mankind. Were these gods actually visitors from the stars? Did they help build Atlantis? If so, what happened to them? And why has no trace of their civilization survived? Perhaps it has. Perhaps every time we get close to the truth, it is deliberately erased. Many researchers who have tried to uncover Atlantis' secrets claim to have faced unexpected obstacles: lost funding, missing documents, projects mysteriously shut down. Some even whisper of threats, lawsuits, or bizarre accidents befalling those who get too close. To conspiracy theorists, these aren't mere coincidences. They are evidence of a larger effort to keep the truth hidden. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Modern technology is changing the game. Satellite imaging, deep-sea drones, and ground-penetrating radar are mapping the Earth in ways never before possible. Ancient ruins lie scattered beneath the ocean's surface, and some believe they could be the remnants of Atlantis. Each new discovery brings more questions than answers. Maybe one day the truth will surface. Or maybe, just like Atlantis itself, it will be swallowed by the tides of history once again. So, was Atlantis real? An advanced civilization that vanished overnight, taking its unimaginable secrets to the ocean floor? Or was it nothing more than a carefully crafted myth? A lesson from Plato on the dangers of pride and unchecked ambition. For those who believe in the conspiracy, Atlantis is more than just a cautionary tale. It's a missing chapter in human history, one that has been deliberately erased. And the fact that we haven't found it yet, that only makes them more certain that powerful forces want to keep it buried forever. But maybe what keeps Atlantis alive isn't just the question of whether it existed, it's what it represents. There's something deeply ingrained in the human psyche, a fascination with lost knowledge, untapped potential, and the idea that an ancient civilization might have held the key to advancements beyond our wildest dreams. Some believe that if Atlantis were ever uncovered, it could change everything. They claim its lost wisdom might include scientific breakthroughs we have yet to rediscover, an understanding of energy that could render fossil fuels obsolete, medical knowledge capable of extending human life, or even forgotten principles of physics that could redefine our grasp of reality. Theories link Atlantis to quantum mechanics, alternative energy sources, and even fields of study that still baffle modern science. What if, beneath the ocean floor, lies a treasure trove of knowledge that could catapult humanity into a new golden age? Yet, for every believer searching for Atlantis, there are those who insist that powerful entities have gone to great lengths to ensure it stays hidden. Theorists argue that governments, secret societies, and corporate giants have worked in tandem to suppress evidence. Because if Atlantis and its secrets were revealed, it could dismantle the structures of power they rely on. A world fueled by oil, controlled by financial hierarchies, and dictated by those who hold the reins of information would have everything to lose if a lost civilization's breakthroughs were suddenly made public. And then there are those who Take the theory even further. Some believe that Atlantis wasn't just technologically advanced but spiritually evolved as well, that its people had unlocked higher states of consciousness, perhaps even established contact with celestial beings. These theories claim Atlantis was not just a civilization, but a bridge between humanity and the divine, until that knowledge was lost, either through human folly or deliberate erasure. To these believers, Atlantis isn't just about lost technology. It's about rediscovering a forgotten path to enlightenment, a way to reclaim an ancient understanding of the universe and our place within it. So, as modern technology advances, as deep-sea exploration uncovers more of Earth's hidden landscapes, the question lingers: will we ever find Atlantis? Could sonar scans or satellite imaging one day reveal a submerged city, proving once and for all that the legend was real? Or will Atlantis forever remain shrouded in mystery, protected by the vastness of the ocean and the weight of millennia? Perhaps it is this very elusiveness that keeps Atlantis alive. It is a riddle without an answer, a dream always just out of reach. And as long as Atlantis remains unfound, it will continue to captivate, a story of both human aspiration and the dangers of ambition. So whether or not Atlantis truly lies beneath the waves, one thing is certain. As long as there are those who believe in its secrets, the hunt for Atlantis and the mysteries it promises will never end. Ethan couldn't remember a time in his life when he hadn't felt out of place. Growing up, he was always the quiet one, the kid who sat at the back of the classroom, nose buried in a book, or staring blankly out the window, wondering if there was something more beyond the narrow confines of the world he knew. While his peers got excited about parties, relationships, and futures mapped out in neat, predictable lines, Ethan felt only a creeping sense of detachment. It wasn't just boredom, it was deeper than that. An unshakable feeling that something was missing. He often imagined himself standing at the edge of an abyss, a vast unknown stretching before him. And sometimes, in the darkest corners of his mind, he wondered if he might one day stumble into it without meaning to. His life had been painfully ordinary, too ordinary, and sometimes that was the scariest thing of all. To break the monotony, Ethan chased after stories, unexplained mysteries, urban legends, anything that hinted at a world beyond the one he knew. He was drawn to things that couldn't be explained, the hidden threads that seemed to weave through reality in ways most people ignored. And of all the strange tales he had ever come across, none fascinated him more than the legend of the backrooms. He first read about it late one night on an obscure online forum. The thread was titled, "If you're not careful, you might slip between the cracks and into the back rooms." The premise was simple and terrifying. The backrooms were said to be a hidden dimension, an endless, decaying labyrinth of empty, yellowed rooms stretching infinitely in every direction. It was a place you could fall into if you weren't careful, vanishing from the world as you knew it. No doors, no windows. Just the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the faint, unsettling feeling that you weren't alone. The idea left him with a chill that lingered long after he closed his laptop that night. Most people dismissed the story as an internet creepypasta, a digital ghost story meant to spook late-night readers. But Ethan wasn't convinced. There was something about the concept that felt real to him. Too real. Like an ancient truth wrapped in modern myth. His fascination with the backrooms deepened into a quiet obsession. He spent hours researching theories, reading every supposed account from people who claimed to have glimpsed it, felt its presence lingering at the edges of their vision. Some spoke of brief, disorienting moments where the world seemed to glitch, like reality itself was unstable. Others described hearing faint echoes in places where there should have been silence, or feeling a deep, inexplicable unease in empty hallways, stairwells, or abandoned buildings. It was the kind of obsession that made him reckless. Ethan started going out at odd hours, wandering through desolate parking garages, exploring forgotten alleyways, searching for places where reality felt thin. He wondered, what if someone could slip through the cracks? What if the backrooms were real, and all it took was the right moment, the right place, the right state of mind? And what if, once you found them, you could never leave? Was deliberate, unsettlingly fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. Ethan's body locked up, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he couldn't move, not at first. It was only when the thing let out a low, wet clicking noise, something between a rattle and a growl, that his paralysis broke. He turned and sprinted. His feet pounded against the damp carpet, the humming of the lights merging with the frantic thudding of his own heartbeat. He didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could hear it. The awful, uneven rhythm of its steps, the occasional scrape of something sharp dragging against the walls. Ethan took turn after turn, hoping, praying for an exit. But the halls just kept repeating, identical, endless, a nightmare with no escape. And then a doorway, a real one, a heavy rusted metal door stood slightly ajar at the end of the corridor, a stark contrast to the sterile yellow walls. It was the first thing he had seen in this place that looked different, and different meant hope. Behind him, the creature let out a sharp, guttural hiss. It was close. Ethan lunged for the door, slamming his weight against it. It groaned but didn't budge. He shoved again, gritting his teeth, every muscle in his body screaming for him to move faster. The clicking noise was right behind him now. With one last desperate push, the door gave way, swinging open just as the thing reached for him. Ethan stumbled forward, crashing onto cold, hard concrete. Silence. The humming lights were gone. The awful, rancid smell was gone. Even the air felt different, cooler, fresher. Ethan lay there, gasping, his body trembling from adrenaline. Slowly, he pushed himself up and turned back toward the door. It was gone, not closed, gone. Just a solid concrete wall where it had been, as if it had never existed. Ethan's breath hitched. He stared at the wall, his mind unable to process what had just happened. His hands shook as he pressed them against the concrete, searching, knocking, nothing. Solid, real. He turned around, trying to take in his surroundings, a parking lot, his university's parking lot. His car was parked exactly where he had left it. The distant sounds of city life drifted in from beyond the lot. Cars, distant chatter, the world still normal. Had it all been in his head? A hallucination? A waking nightmare? Ethan took a shaky step forward, then another. His body still ached. His heartbeat still hadn't settled. He reached into his pocket for his phone, needing to ground himself, to prove to himself that he was back. And that's when he noticed. His shoes, the soles were damp. He lifted one foot, swallowing hard. The bottom of his shoe was stained yellow, a perfect imprint of the backroom's carpet. Ethan's stomach twisted. He stared down at it, his mind racing. It was real. It had to be. The backrooms were real, and he had barely made it out. But what if next? Time. He didn't? Ethan's breath hitched as he stared at the thing before him. Its joints twisted at grotesque angles, bending in ways that defied nature. Every movement it made was deliberate, yet wrong, as if something was forcing a human body into motions it was never meant to perform. A deep, primal terror locked his limbs in place. His mind screamed at him to run, to do anything but stand there, but his legs refused to move. The creature loomed closer, its grotesque form swallowing the narrow hallway in a suffocating wave of dread. Just as it reached out, something inside, Ethan snapped. Survival instincts overrode his paralysis, and he spun on his heel, bolting back the way he came. The thing followed. That horrible, shuffling sound trailed behind him, steady and relentless. It didn't run, didn't lunge, it just kept moving, its presence an inescapable weight pressing on his spine. Ethan's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, his pulse hammering so loud it nearly drowned out the constant hum of the overhead lights. He turned wildly, ducking through unfamiliar rooms, weaving around endless corners, hoping, praying that somehow he could lose it. But no matter how far he ran, he could still feel it. The presence, watching, waiting. Then he stumbled into another room. This one was different, larger. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, vanishing into a darkness that shouldn't have existed in a place so brightly lit. In the center sat a single decrepit armchair, its back turned to him. Ethan braced against the wall, his legs trembling beneath him, his lungs burned. He wanted to believe, just for a moment, that he had outrun it, that maybe, just maybe, he was safe. Then the voice came low, raspy, too close. "Why did you come here?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The voice wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, but there was something wrong beneath its quietness, something lurking in its tone, a malignant amusement that sent a fresh wave of horror through him. I don't know how I got here," he stammered, barely above a whisper. The armchair creaked as if someone, or something, was shifting in it, but he still couldn't see who was sitting there. "No one comes here by accident," the voice murmured, laced with amusement. "You wanted to be here. You belong here now." Ethan's stomach twisted. He shook his head violently. "No, I don't. I don't belong here. I didn't mean to come here." Another slow creak from the chair. Ethan couldn't see the thing in it, but he could feel it, watching him, studying him. The air grew heavy, pressing in from all sides like the walls themselves were leaning closer, desperate to catch his response. "You belong here now," the voice repeated, softer this time, almost gentle. "The back rooms have chosen you. There is no way out." The words burrowed into his skull, cold and absolute. No way out. Ethan's body slumped. His knees hit the floor. Every ounce of hope he had left drained from him, lost in the ceaseless hum of the fluorescent lights. He wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but he was too tired. The maze had taken too much. The thing in the armchair chuckled, a low, mocking sound that echoed in the cavernous space. "Welcome home, Ethan." The lights flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, closing in. The darkness reached for him, and as his vision blurred, as his grip on reality wavered, he knew he was never leaving. Ethan clawed his way back to normalcy. At least he tried to. He told himself, over and over, that it had been a dream, a hallucination, the product of exhaustion, of an overactive imagination. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had been there. The endless maze of yellowed walls, the hum of those flickering fluorescent lights, the thing that had hunted him. None of it had been a dream. He had barely escaped, stumbling through a rusted elevator that had appeared as if summoned, waking up in his dorm room as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and it wasn't over. Weeks passed, but the back rooms never let him go. He saw glimpses of them in reflections, faint flashes of those same sickly yellow walls where none should be. Dark corners seemed to stretch too deep, leading to places they shouldn't. Even the university hallways, once so familiar, felt wrong. Like the world around him was unraveling, letting the maze bleed through. His paranoia grew. He started avoiding empty hallways, checking behind him at every turn. The anxiety gnawed at him, an ever-present weight on his chest. His friends noticed, his exhaustion, his jittery nerves. But what could he say? How could he explain something so impossible, something he barely believed? He told himself it would fade, that it would get better with time. But then the dreams started. Every night, without fail, he was back in the maze. wandering through its endless corridors, its stale, musty air thick in his lungs. No matter how lucid he became, no matter how desperately he tried to wake himself up, he was always pulled deeper, and it was there, watching, waiting, lurking just beyond the flickering lights, its grin wide and empty, its gaze burrowing into his soul. One night, Ethan woke up drenched in sweat, the hum of fluorescent lights ringing in his ears. His pulse pounded against his ribs. He clutched his sheets, forcing himself to take deep, steadying breaths. "A nightmare," he whispered. "Just a nightmare." But the line between waking and dreaming was blurring, and deep in his chest, beneath the fear, something stirred, a whisper of curiosity, or maybe a sickness. Because no matter how much he feared it, no matter how much he tried to escape, a part of him wanted to go back. The fear of returning to the back rooms was unbearable. Yet beneath that terror, something else stirred. A pull, a whisper, in the recesses of his mind, telling him he hadn't seen everything yet, that something waited for him beyond those endless yellow corridors. He knew it would consume him if he went back. He was certain of it, but the need to understand gnawed at him, clawing its way deeper into his thoughts until it became all he could think about. One Friday night, after another sleepless week, he finally gave in. It was almost involuntary, like some unseen force had taken control. Before he even realized what he was doing, Ethan was walking toward the university library, past midnight, the air outside crisp and empty. The building was silent, save for the low hum of the ventilation system. He rode the same elevator as before, pressing the ground floor button, his pulse drumming in his ears. The elevator began its descent. He braced himself, expecting that unnatural jolt, the one that had thrown him into the back rooms the last time. But nothing happened. The elevator stopped smoothly. The doors slid open. The quiet university lobby greeted him. A shaky laugh escaped him. Relief and disappointment churned in his gut. He had been foolish to believe he could return so easily. The back rooms couldn't be summoned like some urban legend. It was just a dream, a hallucination. Shaking his head, he stepped forward and stopped. Something was off. The lobby looked different. The walls had a faint yellow tinge. The air smelled damp, almost mouldy. The overhead lights were dimmer, buzzing softly in a way that made his skin crawl. Dread pooled in his stomach as he turned back toward the elevator. The doors were still open, but the lobby beyond them was gone. In its place stretched a familiar, endless expanse of sickly yellow wallpaper, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a damp, carpeted floor that led into oblivion. Ethan's stomach lurched. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He was back. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself. This time, he wouldn't panic. He would stay calm, map a path, and find his way out. He had done it once. He could do it again. But something was different. The air was thicker, almost suffocating. The lights flickered erratically, casting unnatural shadows that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. The musty smell was stronger now, tinged with something metallic. And the buzzing, it wasn't just noise anymore. It was grating, drilling into his skull like an unbearable static screech. He moved carefully, committing every turn to memory. But no matter how methodically he traced his steps, the back rooms twisted around him, subtly rearranging themselves. The hallways stretched longer. Doorways that had been there a moment ago vanished when he looked back. And then, a sound. A faint, shuffling noise in the distance. Ethan froze. His pulse spiked. He knew that sound. It was here. A jagged silhouette moved at the edge of his vision, rounding a distant corner. The way it moved, unnatural, fluid yet broken, made his skin crawl. He forced himself to breathe, to think. Panicking would get him. Killed. He turned and walked faster, his footfalls muffled by the endless carpet. The shuffling followed. Closer. Ethan refused to look back. He quickened his pace, turning down another corridor. The walls felt narrower now, pressing in like the building itself was swallowing him. The air was stale, heavy with something unseen. The footsteps behind him quickened. His stomach lurched. He was running now, darting from room to room, searching, desperately for something, anything that resembled an exit. But the rooms had changed. They weren't the same endless hallways anymore. They were traps. Walls that weren't there a second ago suddenly closed in behind him. Doors that should have led to another corridor instead opened into blank, windowless rooms with no way out. The thing was close. Its presence was oppressive, warping the air around it. Its breathing, slow, wheezing, sent shivers down his spine. Then he saw it. A door. A wide, empty room stretched before him, and at the far end, something new. Something he hadn't seen before. A single, heavy metal door. He didn't think. He ran. The creature let out a horrible, wet breath behind him. Ethan threw himself forward, slamming into the door and wrenching it open just as the thing reached for him. A sickening, guttural sound rumbled behind him as he hurled himself inside. The door slammed shut. Silence. His back pressed against the cold metal, chest heaving. The air was different here, quieter. The relentless buzzing had faded to a soft hum. The wallpaper was still yellow, but the atmosphere felt untouched. As if even the back rooms had forgotten this place existed. His gaze drifted to the center of the room. Another door. This one was rusted metal, different from the others. Something about it felt wrong, or maybe right. Maybe this was it. A way out. Heart pounding, Ethan stepped forward. He reached for the handle, his fingers brushing against the cold, corroded surface. He hesitated for only a moment before pulling. The door groaned open. A passage stretched before him, narrow, suffocating. The walls were rough and uneven, damp with something that smelled like old stone. He stepped inside, and the door shut behind him with a heavy thud. The deeper he went, the colder it became. The fluorescent hum was gone. Silence settled around him, broken only by the distant drip of water echoing through the darkness. The passage twisted unpredictably, narrowing until he had to squeeze through. His hands scraped against the jagged walls, but he kept moving. There was no going back now. Then, a light. Faint. Flickering. Desperate, he stumbled toward it, his breath shallow with anticipation. He reached the end of the passage. A door stood. Before him, old, wooden. Symbols were etched into its surface, strange markings that meant nothing to him but filled him with unease. His fingers trembled as he touched the handle. With a deep breath, he turned it. The door creaked open, and he stepped through. Ethan froze. His bedroom, his actual bedroom. The first light of dawn seeped through the blinds. The distant hum of city, traffic murmured outside his window. The familiar scent of his apartment filled his lungs. He was home. For a long moment, he just stood there, dazed, disbelieving. Somehow, impossibly, he had escaped. His legs gave out and he sank onto his bed, exhaustion crashing over him in waves. His heart pounded, but he was safe. He was here. But as he closed his eyes, the silence settled around him, and deep in the recesses of his mind, past the edge of reason, something lingered. A whisper in the darkness, a feeling in his bones. The back rooms had let him go, but they had not forgotten him, and they were waiting. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights, the stale, mildewed air, the creature's hollow, unblinking eyes. It haunted him. Even now, in the supposed safety of his bedroom, Ethan could feel it, a presence that lurked just beyond sight, in the corners of his vision, in the silence pressing against his ears. Then he noticed the chill, a subtle, creeping cold that seeped through the walls, brushing against his skin like icy fingers trailing along his arms. His breath fogged in the dim light. That had never happened before. His apartment had always been warm, cozy, a sanctuary. But now, the warmth had been drained from it. Ethan sat up, his pulse quickening. Everything looked normal. His posters still lined the walls. His desk was cluttered with papers. His blanket lay crumpled on the mattress. And yet, something was wrong. The silence was deafening. Outside his window, the familiar sounds of the city, distant car horns, voices, the hum of late-night life, were gone. In their place was a thick, suffocating stillness. He reached for his phone, tapped the screen. Nothing. Blank, lifeless. His reflection stared back at him in the dark glass, his wide, fearful eyes barely visible in the dim glow of the screen. He tapped again. Harder. His heart pounded. Then he heard it, faint, almost imperceptible at first. A low, droning hum. His stomach twisted. No. 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 Dr. Emily Carter stared out at the endless, unbroken horizon, the vast expanse of the Nevada desert stretching in all directions. The heat shimmered above the cracked earth, distorting the distant hills like a mirage. She adjusted her sunglasses, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. A lone stretch of road lay ahead, leading toward the most infamous military installation in the world, Area 51. Her car, a dusty, battered sedan that had seen better days, rumbled under the strain of the relentless desert heat. The engine sputtered in protest, as if it too wanted to turn back. Emily took a slow, steady breath. For years, she had devoted herself to astrophysics, scouring the skies for signals, searching for proof of life beyond Earth. But never, not once, had she imagined her work would bring her here, to this place, a place of rumors and paranoia, a place where secrets were buried so deep, even whispers of the truth were enough to disappear people. Her phone buzzed, breaking her trance. A text. Unknown number. It's time. Meet at the usual spot. A cold prickle ran down her spine. She already knew who it was. Marcus Donovan, an enigmatic agent, her reluctant handler in a government investigation she had been dragged into years ago. He had told her things she could barely comprehend. But he had never been fully transparent. Always cryptic. Always careful. Now he was calling her back. Emily exhaled slowly. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. This was it. The final step. The point of no return. The rumors about Area 51 had always been wild. Alien bodies, reverse-engineered technology, projects that defied the very fabric of human understanding. She had dismissed most of it as paranoid delusion. And yet, here she was. Her car rolled to a stop. The meeting point was a lonely, weather-beaten shack standing by the side of the road. There was no sign, no markings. Just a structure that looked as though it had been forgotten by time. Emily cut the engine. The silence of the desert pressed down around her. A shadow moved in the doorway. Marcus Donovan. Tall. Sharp-featured. Always composed. Always unreadable. He wore a black suit. No tie. The top buttons of his white shirt undone in the heat. His sleeves were rolled up. But despite his casual stance, there was something different in his posture, something tense. Emily. His voice was low, measured. She stepped forward, swallowing the unease creeping up her spine. His gaze flicked over the horizon before locking onto hers. We need to move. Now. Her pulse quickened. Why? His jaw tightened. He turned his head slightly, as if listening for something beyond their conversation. Then, in a low voice, "They're already watching. The air turned heavy. Emily's stomach clenched. She forced herself to stay steady. Who's watching? Who are they? Marcus glanced toward the distant hills. His expression darkened. The ones who never stop. His voice barely above a whisper. The ones who keep the truth buried. Emily followed his gaze. The desert stretched on, vast and empty. But for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't expected. A quiet, creeping fear. She turned back to him, her mouth dry. Marcus, what's really going on here? He didn't answer. Instead, he motioned toward the shack. Come inside. The metal door slid open with a low, mechanical hiss, revealing a sterile, dimly lit hallway. The air smelled of antiseptic. And something else. Ozone, maybe. Or something metallic. Something unnatural. Emily's pulse quickened as she stepped inside, her breath shallow. The walls were cold, unwelcoming, lined with smooth steel that reflected the flickering fluorescent lights above. Every footstep echoed, too loud, as if the hallway itself was swallowing sound. Marcus walked ahead of her, his shoulders tense. He wasn't speaking much, not like earlier. That silence put her on edge. He led her down another corridor, this one even darker. The overhead bulbs buzzed softly, flickering erratically, casting long, restless shadows along the floor. Emily's stomach churned. At the end of the hall stood a door, far more imposing than the others. It was reinforced, marked with biohazard warnings and cryptic symbols she didn't recognize. A biometric scanner blinked beside it, waiting. Marcus hesitated, his hand hovering over the keypad. This is it, he murmured, voice low, almost reluctant. Once we go through, there's no turning back. Emily swallowed, her throat dry. The unease gnawed at her insides, but something else pushed her forward. A gnawing curiosity, a need to understand. She met Marcus's gaze and nodded, barely finding her voice. Let's go. With a final glance at her, Marcus punched in a long sequence of numbers. A retinal scanner whirred, flashing red as it confirmed his identity. The door unlocked with a heavy clunk and slid open, revealing the vast chamber beyond. Emily's breath hitched. The room stretched before her, filled with rows of sealed containers, blinking monitors, and equipment that looked far too advanced for any government lab she'd ever seen. But it wasn't just the technology, it was what was inside those containers. Strange artifacts, pieces of metal, some crystalline, some smooth and impossibly dark, like fragments of something ancient and not of this world. Some of the containers were cracked open, exposing their contents. A jagged silver appendage, a piece of a ship that seemed to shift under the light, as if it were alive. And at the far end of the chamber, behind a thick observation window, a figure moved, shadowed, indistinct, watching. Emily's stomach twisted. "What is this place?" she whispered. Marcus exhaled sharply. "This," he said, "is where it all began. This is where they study the things they don't want anyone to know." His words settled over her like a weight. She stepped closer to one of the containers, her fingers hovering near the glass. The object inside looked like a ship fragment, metallic, organic in its design, something beyond human craftsmanship. It pulsed faintly, a low vibration she could feel in her bones. "This is," she struggled for words, shaking her head. "This is impossible." "That's what they want you to believe," Marcus muttered. His jaw tightened as he stepped to another container, his fingers brushing its surface as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Emily glanced around. There were dozens of these containers, each holding something more bizarre than the last. Some contained unidentifiable objects. Others held remnants of bodies. Not human. Something else. But in the center of the room stood a single object that pulled at her like gravity. A cube, encased in a transparent, airtight chamber. It pulsed with a soft, eerie glow. Its surface shimmered, shifting as though it were alive. emitting a faint hum that made the hair on Emily's arms stand on end. There was something in the air around it, a presence. Emily's chest tightened. "Is that—" She trailed off. Marcus nodded. His voice was barely audible. "That's the key, the one thing that can change everything." A strange sensation crawled up Emily's spine. She took an involuntary step forward, her fingers itching to reach out, to touch it, to understand. But something deep, primal, warned her not to. What? What does it do? She breathed. Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something raw in his expression. Admiration, regret, fear. "It doesn't obey our laws," he finally said. "It's not from our world. It doesn't work by any logic we understand." Emily's stomach twisted. "You mean it communicates?" Marcus interrupted, his eyes dark. "In ways we can't explain, in ways we weren't meant to understand." A cold dread seeped into her bones. "Communicates?" Marcus exhaled through his nose, nodding. "We think it has a consciousness of its own. We've been studying it for years, trying to unlock its secrets. But every time we get close, the consequences get worse." Emily's mouth felt dry. "What kind of consequences?" Marcus hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The kind that make people disappear," he said. "The kind that change your perception of reality. A beat. And the kind that draw attention." A sharp, icy fear settled in her stomach. "Attention?" Marcus turned to her, his face unreadable. "Attention we don't want." Before she could respond, a loud alarm shattered the silence. A shrill, piercing wail echoed through the facility. Red warning lights flashed, painting the walls in an ominous glow. Somewhere in the distance, doors slammed shut, and behind the observation glass, the shadowed figure moved. Closer. Marcus's face turned pale, his usual composure cracking. His grip tightened around Emily's arm as he yanked her toward the door. "They found us!" he hissed, urgency bleeding into his voice. "We need to go, now!" Emily stumbled, barely managing to keep pace. "What's happening?" she demanded, breathless. "There's no time to explain." His voice was tight, controlled, but she could hear the undercurrent of fear. "They know we're here. They're going to shut everything down." Behind them, the sound of footsteps thundered through, the labyrinthine hallways, heavy, deliberate, closing in fast. Emily's mind spun. What had she just seen? The cube, the artifacts, the impossible truth staring her in the face. And now, someone, something, was after them. Marcus yanked her down a narrow stairwell leading to a lower level. The air grew colder as they descended, thick, with the scent of old metal, and something stale, something lifeless. The alarm screamed above them, growing more frantic with each second. At the bottom of the stairs, Marcus pressed his hand against the wall. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, click. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The glow from the monitors cast long shadows, making the space feel smaller than it was. Marcus stepped inside and exhaled. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but edged with finality. Emily hesitated at the threshold. The hum of the control panel vibrated through the air, an ever-present reminder that something monumental was about to happen. "End what?" she asked. Marcus turned to her, his eyes dark, unreadable. "The conspiracy. The cover-up. Everything you've seen. The truth, Emily. But now, you have to decide." The words sank into her like stones. She looked around. The secrets of Area 51, the cube, the alien artifacts. It was all too much. And yet, here she stood, at the precipice of something world-altering. She had the power to change everything. She forced herself to meet Marcus's gaze. "What happens if we just leave?" she asked, her voice raw. If we let it stay buried? For the first time, Marcus hesitated. He glanced at the control panel, then back at her. The alarms continued their wailing countdown to disaster. "They'll come for us," he said finally, his voice grim. "If we disappear, we're just another couple of bodies added to the list of people who got too close." His expression darkened. "And nothing will change. The world will go on, blind, oblivious." Emily's breath caught. Every conspiracy, theory she had ever read, every whispered claim of government cover-ups, every impossible story about extraterrestrial life, it all led to this. The truth was here, and she was holding the key to it in her hands. Marcus took a step closer. His voice dropped lower, more intense. "Do you want to know what they really fear?" he asked. "It's not just the public finding out about the aliens. It's what happens after." Emily swallowed hard. "When the world knows," Marcus continued, "they won't just accept it. They'll demand answers, and those answers will shatter everything. The economy, governments, religions, people's very perception of reality." His eyes flickered with something dark, something close to reverence. "That's why they've kept it hidden for so long." Emily exhaled, unsteady. The weight of what he was saying pressed down on her, suffocating. If she did this, if she exposed the truth, there would be no undoing it. The world would change in ways no one could predict. Her gaze drifted across the room, to the cube, still glowing faintly, still humming. That strange, magnetic pull was back, tugging at her insides, calling to her. She remembered the way it vibrated in the air, the way it felt like it was alive. This wasn't just some advanced technology. It was something else, something deeper. She stepped closer to the control panel, her fingers trembling as she reached toward Marcus. "What happens if I activate it?" she asked. Her voice barely came out. "The cube, what does it do?" For the first time, Marcus's mask cracked, and he looked afraid. Marcus's eyes flickered with something she hadn't seen before. Fear. "I don't know," he admitted, voice tight. "We've tried to interact with it, tried to study it, but it doesn't work the way anything else does." His gaze shifted toward the cube, the pulsating glow reflecting in his pupils. "It's not just a piece of technology. It's alive. It reacts to human presence, to thought. Some of us think it might be a gateway, or a communication device." Emily's pulse quickened. "A gateway to what?" she pressed. Marcus hesitated. "That's the problem. Activating it could have consequences we can't predict. It might expose us to things we're not ready for." Emily swallowed hard, her fingers hovering over the control panel. Decades of silence, countless lives lost to keep this place hidden. The weight of it all pressed against her chest. "Then we need to find out," she said, voice steady. "We can't leave here without understanding what it really is." Marcus didn't argue. Instead, he stepped back, giving her space. "You're right," he said, his tone quiet. "But be ready. Whatever happens, you can't undo it." Emily nodded. She took a deep breath and pressed the button. The reaction was immediate. At first, a subtle hum vibrated through the floor, crawling up her legs like static. Then, the tremor deepened, pulsing in waves that rippled through the walls. The cube's glow intensified, its light moving in rhythm with the vibrations. The air thickened, warped, as though reality itself was folding in on itself. Emily's skin prickled. "What's happening?" she shouted over the growing noise. "I don't know," Marcus yelled back. "Get away from it." But it was too late. The cube exploded. Light burst outward in a blinding flash, swallowing everything. Emily raised her arms, shielding her face as a deafening sound, like the roar of 1,000 voices speaking at once, shook the very fabric of the room. And then, silence. Not just quiet, Absence. Emily opened her eyes, her pulse hammering. Everything around her looked the same. The walls, the control panel, the monitors. But something was wrong. The air had shifted. The very fabric of the room shimmered, as though it wasn't entirely solid anymore. The faint hum that had always been there was gone. In its place was a stillness so absolute it made her skin crawl. Marcus stood beside her, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. "What?" Emily swallowed. "What just happened?" Marcus exhaled, shaky. "I don't know." His eyes darted to the cube. "But we activated something we weren't supposed to." A sudden flicker of movement. The control panel lit up. The screen flickered, filled with symbols. Not human, not of this world. Lines and shapes twisted and pulsed, moving as if they were alive. Emily's breath hitched. "It's communicating." Marcus stepped back. "This isn't good." His voice was sharp now, tense. "We need to leave." Before they could move, the door slammed open. Armed guards rushed in, their weapons raised, their faces hard. Behind them, men in dark suits followed, high-ranking officials. Emily's stomach dropped. A tall man in a suit stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Carter." She recognized him from classified documents she wasn't supposed to have seen. His voice was ice. "We were hoping you'd cooperate." His eyes flicked toward the activated control panel. "But it seems you've already made your choice." Emily's chest tightened. They weren't going to let them leave. "You'll come with us now," Carter continued, calm but absolute. "You've seen too much, and now you'll never leave." Marcus shifted subtly, his fingers brushing the weapon at his side. Ready. But before he could act, Emily spoke first. "No." The word rang through the room like a gunshot. The suited men exchanged glances. The air in the room turned razor sharp, crackling with unspoken violence. The cube still hummed softly behind them, like it was waiting. Emily didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let them bury the truth. Her heart pounded, the weight of her choices pressing down like an iron vice. They had found her, and they weren't going to let her go. The man in the suit stepped forward, his cold, unreadable gaze locking onto hers. He was tall, his dark hair slicked back with meticulous precision, his face sculpted into an expression that gave away nothing. Behind him, the guards tightened their grips on their weapons, fingers twitching toward the triggers. "You have no idea what you've unleashed, Dr. Carter," the man said, his voice smooth but laced with something dangerous, something final. "You've activated something beyond your understanding, something no human was ever meant to touch." Emily. Carter squared her shoulders. She wouldn't back down. Not now, not when she was this close. Her mind raced, but her resolve only hardened. "What is it?" she demanded. "What is the cube? What does it do?" The man's lips curled into a humorless smirk. "You wouldn't understand. No one would. But that doesn't matter anymore. The damage is done. Now, we have to clean up your mess." Behind her, Marcus shifted slightly. His hand hovered near his sidearm, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. She could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a dying star, coiled and waiting. The suited man raised a hand, a calculated gesture, and the guards hesitated, lowering their weapons slightly. "We're not here to kill you, Dr. Carter. Not yet, anyway. We're here to take you somewhere more secure." "Secure?" Emily repeated, her voice rising. "You mean a prison?" The man's expression remained impassive. "You've seen too much. And worse, you exposed the cube. There are forces at play now that neither of us can control. We need to contain the situation, and you're the only one who can help us." Marcus let out a bitter chuckle. "You really think you can control it? After everything we've seen? You have no idea what you're dealing with." The suited man's gaze flicked to Marcus, irritation flashing across his otherwise unreadable face. "We don't need your input, Mr. Donovan. We've been handling things like this long before you were ever a factor." Emily stepped forward. "You're lying," she said. "This whole thing, it's a cover-up. You're scared of what the cube can do, and you want to bury it before the truth gets out. A flicker of something crossed the man's face. Not fear, not anger, just a moment of consideration before he smothered it. The air in the room grew heavier. The guards behind him shifted, their bodies tense, fingers still near their triggers. "That's enough," the man said, his voice now edged with finality. "You're coming with us. Resist, and we won't hesitate." Emily's pulse slammed in her ears. She couldn't let them take her, not when she was so close. The cube had responded to her before. She could feel it now, humming at the edge of her senses, almost as if it was aware, almost as if it was waiting. And then, it happened. The humming grew louder, filling the air with an eerie vibration that pressed against the walls. The lights flickered, elongated shadows twisting unnaturally across the floor. The air turned thick, heavy, as if the very fabric of reality was straining to hold itself together. One of the guards stiffened. "What the hell is—" The suited man's hand flew to his earpiece. His pupils shrank. "We're not alone," he said, his voice uncharacteristically tense. Before anyone could move, a sound rolled through the room, a deep, guttural resonance, something between a hum and a distant primal roar. The walls rippled, reality bent, and then, in a blink, the world changed. The guards froze, their weapons still raised, but now pointed at nothing. Emily gasped. The metallic walls of the facility were gone, replaced by an endless black void scattered with shifting, distant lights. The floor beneath them shimmered like liquid, but when she shifted her weight, it held firm. This isn't possible," one of the guards stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Where are we?" Emily's breath caught in her throat, because she already knew the cube had opened, and whatever was on the other side had just let them in. The cube had done this, not a portal. No, this was something deeper, something that wove through dimensions, timelines, entire worlds. Emily didn't know how or why, but it was undeniable now. The cube wasn't just technology. It was a doorway to something far greater and far more dangerous. The suited man's face had lost all composure. His hands trembled as he frantically tried to recalibrate the control panel, but it was useless. The screen flashed erratically, symbols distorting and shifting like they were being rewritten by something beyond comprehension. Nothing responded. "This is impossible," he muttered, almost to himself. His voice was raw, like he was forcing himself to breathe. The cube was never meant to activate like this. It was supposed to stay dormant, sealed away. "Then why didn't you just leave it alone?" Marcus snapped, his voice sharp with disgust. "Why did you think you could control something so far beyond your understanding?" The suited man turned toward him, his face pale, his eyes wild with something close to fear. "You think you're in control now? You think the cube just did this on its own?" His breath came in shallow gasps. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Emily turned, scanning the alien, shifting landscape around them. The world had melted away into something else, something raw, unfinished, infinite. "Then what is it?" she demanded. "What is the cube? Why does it have this power?" The suited man opened his mouth, then stopped. A shudder passed through the space itself, as if the air had been struck by an unseen force. The hum in the room swelled, growing louder, resonating deeper. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was inside them, pressing against their bones, threading through their very cells. And then, a voice. Deep, resonant, everywhere. "You have opened the door." The words weren't spoken in any human tongue, but Emily understood them, felt them, sink into the marrow of her being. The voice didn't come from one direction. It came from all directions, vibrating through the very fabric of existence. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything she could understand. The suited man staggered back, his face twisted in horror. "No, No, it wasn't supposed to. Emily's throat was dry. Her heartbeat slammed against her ribs. Who are you? She forced out. What are you? I am the way, the voice answered. It was calm, but there was something in it, something ancient, something vast. The cube is but a guide, a key to unlocking the knowledge that has long been forgotten. But be warned, child of Earth. Truth comes with a price. The very air seemed to bend with the words. Something inside Emily stirred, deep in a place she didn't even know existed. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a consciousness. The suited man's lips moved, but no sound came out. His body was rigid, his pupils dilated like a man staring into the abyss. Finally, his breath hitched. We've made a grave mistake, he whispered. Emily turned to Marcus. Her mind was still spinning, her body humming with whatever energy was saturating the room. This is it, she said, barely above a whisper. This is what they were hiding. Marcus didn't look away from the cube. His hands were clenched at his sides. His jaw was tight, and for the first time, she saw something she had never seen in him before. Fear. This is just the beginning, he said. The voice spoke again, louder now, more commanding. The time of secrets has ended. The gate is open, and the old ones shall return. The words carried weight, power, the kind that stretched beyond time, beyond space, beyond human meaning. The air crackled, the hum became unbearable, vibrating through their skulls, their bones. The ground beneath them, once solid, rippled, reflecting fractured images of other worlds, distant galaxies, civilizations too ancient to comprehend. The suited man stumbled forward, his fingers clawing at the dead control panel. His entire body shook. I told you, he gasped. This was never supposed to happen. Emily turned to Marcus, her pulse slamming against her throat. The cube, still pulsating at the center of the chaos, had done something irreversible. It had connected them to something far older than Earth, something that had been waiting. We have to stop it, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of fear rising in her chest. Whatever it is, we can't let it go any further. Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze locked onto hers. Stopping it won't be easy, he said. The cube didn't just open a door. It woke something up. The voice spoke again. The gate is open. The safe world around them shuddered. The walls dissolved further, twisting like liquid, the ground buckling beneath their feet. The air itself pulled, as if something massive was pushing through, forcing its way into their reality. Emily felt it, not just around her, but inside her, in the very air she breathed. The cube hadn't just unlocked knowledge, it had summoned something. And now, it was coming. Emily's heart pounded against her ribs, the weight of her choices pressing down like an iron grip. The government had come for her, and she knew they wouldn't let her go easily. The suited man, the one who had spoken before, stepped forward. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto hers. He was tall, his dark hair slicked back with precision, his face a mask of stone. Behind him, the guards stood rigid, fingers twitching near the triggers of their weapons. "You don't understand what you've activated, Dr. Carter," the man said, his voice smooth, but laced with an unspoken threat. The cube was never meant to be touched by human hands. Emily squared her shoulders, her mind racing but her resolve hardening. "Then what is it?" she demanded. "What does it do?" The man's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "You wouldn't understand. No one could. But that doesn't matter anymore." His expression darkened. "The damage is done. Now we have to clean up your mess." Behind her, Marcus shifted slightly, his hand hovering near his sidearm. He was tense, but he hadn't made a move yet. Emily could feel his hesitation. He was waiting. The suited man raised a hand. "Stand down," he ordered the guards. We're not here to kill you, Dr. Carter. He paused. Not yet, anyway. Emily's stomach twisted. A secure location, she repeated, her voice rising, with disbelief. You mean prison? The man didn't flinch. You've seen too much, and now you've exposed the cube. There are forces at play that neither of us can control. We need to understand what it's doing. His gaze hardened. And you're the only one who can help us, Marcus scoffed. Help you? His voice was low, venomous. You think you can control it? After everything we've seen, you still have no idea what you're dealing with. The man's eyes flicked toward Marcus, irritation flashing across his face. We don't need your assistance, Mr. Donovan. We've been handling these matters long before you were even born. Emily stepped forward, her jaw tightening. You're lying, she said. You've been hiding the truth. You're afraid of the cube's power. You want to suppress it, bury it, before it exposes everything. The suited man's expression darkened. He didn't respond immediately, but the air grew heavier with tension. The guards shifted, sensing the shift, fingers once again ghosting over their triggers. Finally, the man spoke. Enough. His voice was cold. We're taking you to the holding facility. Any resistance? And then, it happened. The humming sound from the cube intensified, vibrating through the walls, seeping into their bones. The fluorescent lights flickered violently, casting jagged, moving shadows. The air thickened, heavy, with something unnatural, something alive. One of the guards stepped forward, gripping his weapon. What the hell is happening? The suited man's hand flew to his earpiece, his calm demeanor slipping. We're not alone, he muttered, his voice tight. Before anyone could react, a low, guttural noise filled the room. A sound both ancient and wrong, like a hum mixed with a distant roar. The walls rippled as if reality itself was bending. And then, in the blink of an eye, the world changed. The sterile metallic walls of the facility were gone. In their place stretched an endless black expanse, dotted with shifting, pulsing lights. The floor beneath them shimmered, rippling like water but somehow solid. One of the guards stumbled back. This isn't possible. His voice shook. Where the hell are we? Emily turned, her breath catching in her throat. The cube had done this. It hadn't just opened a portal. No, this was deeper. Something that connected dimensions, timelines, worlds. The suited man's face drained of color. He rushed to the control panel, hands shaking as he tried to recalibrate the system. The screen flickered erratically, symbols flashing in patterns that made no sense. Nothing responded. This is impossible, he muttered under his breath. It was never meant to activate like this. It was supposed to stay dormant, sealed away. Marcus let out a bitter laugh. Then why didn't you just leave it alone? His voice dripped with contempt. You thought you could control it, didn't you? The suited man turned to him, his pale face twisted in something close to terror. You think this happened by accident? You think the cube just did this on its own? His voice trembled. You have no idea what you've unleashed. Emily's eyes darted across the distorted horizon. Then tell us, she demanded. What is the cube? Why does it have this power? The suited man opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the room trembled again. A voice filled the air, a voice that wasn't human. It came from nowhere and everywhere, reverberating inside their very minds, deep, resonant, and ancient. You have opened the door. The words sent ice through Emily's veins. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a consciousness, something far beyond human comprehension. The suited man stumbled back. No, he whispered. No, it wasn't supposed to. Emily swallowed hard, her voice barely above a breath. Who are you? I am the way. The voice echoed through the vast void, the space itself vibrating with its presence. The cube is a guide, a key, a doorway to the knowledge your kind has long forgotten. Emily shuddered, the weight of the words crushed down on her. But be warned, child of Earth, the voice continued. The truth comes with a price. The air thickened. The ground beneath them shimmered, reflecting fragmented images, distant worlds, alien, stars, technologies far beyond their comprehension. The suited man fell to his knees, his face ashen. "We didn't understand," he murmured. "We thought we could control it." His voice broke. "We never knew." The cube pulsed brighter, its energy crackling through the void. Time was running out. Emily turned to Marcus, her pulse pounding in her ears. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what they've been hiding all along." Marcus's gaze was steady, but fear flickered beneath the surface. "And it's just the beginning." The voice spoke again, louder this time, more commanding. "The time of secrets has ended. The gate is open. The old ones shall return." A low hum vibrated through the space, rattling their bones. The ground trembled violently, the very fabric of reality rippling like a torn veil. Emily felt a pull, something ancient, something inevitable. She looked at Marcus. "We have to decide." Her voice wavered but held firm. "Do we reveal it? Let the world know?" Marcus hesitated. Then he nodded. "The truth is already out there. Whether the world is ready, that's another question." The cube pulsed one final time, and then a blinding flash of light swallowed them whole. When the light faded, they were back. The facility was as it had been before, as if nothing had changed. Except the cube was gone. On the control panel, a single message flickered. "The truth has been set in motion. There is no going back." Emily's breath hitched. The old ones were watching, waiting. The future had already begun, and the world would never be the same. Ellis James had been fascinated with birds for as long as he could remember. As a child, he would spend hours perched on the windowsill of his family's modest suburban home, watching sparrows flit between the branches of the maple tree in their front yard. While other kids rode bikes or played video games, Ellis lost himself in the delicate motions of wings and beaks, the way those tiny creatures seemed to exist in a world just beyond human reach. His father, a quiet man with a deep love for nature, had introduced him to birdwatching. Every Sunday before dawn, they would wake early, pack a thermos of coffee, and drive out to the wetlands with their binoculars in hand. Ellis still remembered the way the early light shimmered on the water, the air vibrating with the sharp calls of herons and the soft chirps of wrens. His father would point out different species, speaking with the kind of reverence most reserved for deities. "Birds are freedom," his father had once said. "They don't belong to anyone. They just are." When Ellis was 11, that freedom was stolen from his father. A heart attack took him in the middle of the night, sudden and cruel. For weeks afterward, Ellis found himself retreating to their favorite birding spots, clutching his father's old field guide, straining to hear his voice in the rustling leaves. The birds became his solace, their songs filling the silence his father had left behind. As Ellis grew older, his passion for birds only deepened. He joined local bird-watching groups, attended conservation lectures, devoured every book on ornithology he could find. He even toyed with the idea of becoming a wildlife biologist. But life had other plans. Instead, he ended up in a corporate job. Comfortable, stable, but suffocating. Birdwatching remained his sanctuary. On weekends, he would escape to nature, binoculars around his neck, notebook in his pocket. The flash of red on a cardinal's wing, the looping call of a wood thrush. These small moments were his escape. But lately, something felt off. The birds seemed fewer, their songs quieter. Some of his favorite species had stopped showing up in their usual places. And then, he started noticing strange patterns in their behavior. Erratic flight paths, unnatural stillness, as if something unseen had altered them. He dismissed it at first. Climate change, urban expansion. But then came the conspiracy theory. At first, he laughed it off. Birds aren't real. Ridiculous. The internet was flooded with memes and grainy videos, pigeons moving robotically, supposed whistleblowers claiming the government had replaced real birds with surveillance drones. It was absurd. Birds had been his constant, his link to his father, his connection to something beyond human control. The idea that they could be fake was unthinkable, but that all changed the day he found the pigeon. It was a crisp autumn morning, the trees ablaze with red and gold. Ellis had set out early to his favourite park, enjoying the hush before the world fully woke. He was watching a flock of starlings dart across the sky when something on the ground caught his eye. A bird, twitching unnaturally. Ellis crouched beside it. The pigeon's left wing was bent at an odd angle, its head lolling slightly to the side. He reached out, murmuring softly, "Easy, little one. Let me help." But the moment his fingers brushed its feathers, he froze. Something was wrong. The feathers felt too smooth, too uniform. There was no warmth beneath them, no delicate rise and fall of breath. He pressed gently, and with a soft click, a panel on the pigeon's chest popped open. Ellis recoiled. Inside, tangled wires and blinking lights pulsed beneath a metallic frame. His stomach twisted. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. What the hell? The pigeon twitched again, and then a crackling voice, tinny and robotic, emitted from somewhere. Inside it, Unit 472 compromised. Dispatch retrieval team. Ellis scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering. He scanned the park, expecting, what? A van screeching to a stop. Men in suits rushing toward him. Nothing. The park was empty, serene. Only the leaves whispered in the breeze. His hands shook as he picked up the pigeon, no, the thing, and shoved it into his backpack. He needed answers. His first instinct was to take it to someone who could make sense of it. Tara. Tara was an old friend, a tech-savvy hacker with a knack for dismantling anything electronic. She lived in a cramped apartment cluttered with half-built drones and glowing monitors, the walls covered in schematics and tangled wires. If anyone could figure out what the hell was going on, it was her. Ellis had spent his life believing in the simple beauty of birds. But now, a terrifying thought clawed its way into his mind. What if the conspiracy theorists weren't crazy after all? Ellis James had been fascinated with birds for as long as he could remember. As a child, he'd spend hours perched on the windowsill of his family's modest suburban home, watching sparrows flit between the branches of the old maple tree in their front yard. While other kids played video games or rode bikes, Ellis would lose himself in the delicate movements of wings and beaks, the way these tiny creatures seemed to exist in a world just beyond human reach. His father, a quiet man with a deep love for nature, had been the one to introduce him to birdwatching. Every Sunday morning, before the sun even hinted at rising, they would wake up, grab their binoculars, and drive to the nearby wetlands. Ellis still remembered the way the first light shimmered on the water, the air filled with the sharp calls of herons and the soft chirps of wrens. His father would point out each species, describing their habits and migrations with a reverence most people reserved for gods. "Birds are freedom," his father had once told him, voice low and thoughtful. "They don't belong to anyone. They just are." Then, when Ellis was 11, his father was gone. A heart attack stole him away in the middle of the night. For weeks afterward, Ellis wandered alone through their favorite birding spots, clutching his father's old field guide, straining to hear his voice in the rustling leaves. The birds became his solace, their songs filling the silence his father had left behind. As Ellis grew older, his passion for birds only deepened. He joined local bird-watching groups, attended conservation lectures, devoured every book on ornithology he could find. He even considered becoming a wildlife biologist, but life had other plans. Bills had to be paid, and he ended up in a corporate job that drained him, left him yearning for the wild. On weekends, he escaped to parks and reserves, binoculars around, his neck, notebook in his pocket. He found joy in the little things, the flash of red on a cardinal's wing, the looping call of a wood thrush. But in recent years, something had changed. The birds seemed fewer, their songs quieter. Some of his favorite species hadn't returned to their usual places. And then there were the strange patterns, the way certain birds moved in perfect synchronization, the unnatural stillness of some, the way they almost seemed aware. At first, he dismissed it. Climate change, urban expansion, the usual explanations. Then came the conspiracy theory. Birds aren't real. At first, Ellis laughed it off, like everyone else, a ridiculous internet joke. But the more he saw, the more it gnawed at him. The memes, the so-called evidence, grainy videos of pigeons moving with an eerie mechanical stiffness, supposed whistleblowers claiming they had worked on secret avian surveillance projects. Ellis hated it, hated how people mocked his passion, how his social media feeds were flooded with images of pigeons charging on power lines, seagulls with Wi-Fi signals. "You're chasing robots," his co-workers teased. He ignored them, until the day he found the pigeon. It was a crisp autumn morning. Ellis had set out early to his favorite park, inhaling the cool air as he watched a flock of starlings twist and turn against the sky, their movements mesmerizing. Then, something on the ground caught his eye, a bird, twitching unnaturally. Ellis crouched beside it. The pigeon's left wing was bent at a strange angle, its head lolling to the side. Instinct took over. He reached out, murmuring softly, "Easy, little one. Let me help." But the moment his fingers brushed its feathers, something felt wrong, too smooth, too uniform. He pressed slightly. Click. A panel in the pigeon's chest popped open, revealing a tangle of tiny wires and blinking lights. Ellis yanked his hand back, breath catching in his throat. No, this couldn't be real. The pigeon twitched again. Then, a tiny voice crackled from within. "Unit 472 compromised. Dispatch. Retrieval team." Ellis scrambled to his feet, eyes darting around the park. Empty. Or was it? His mind raced. Was this some kind of prank? A toy? His heart hammered as he scooped up the mechanical bird and shoved it into his backpack. He needed answers. Tara lived in a cramped apartment cluttered with glowing monitors, half-built drones, and enough wires to rewire the city. She was the closest thing to a hacker Ellis knew. If anyone could make sense of this, it was her. She raised an eyebrow when he dumped the pigeon onto her workbench. "What is this? Some kind of art project?" she asked, poking at the lifeless bird. "No," Ellis said, still breathless. "I found it in the park. It's not a bird, Tara. It's a machine." That got her attention. She leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Let's find out what it does." With practiced precision, she pried the pigeon open, further exposing its guts. Tiny cameras, a GPS module, what looked like a transmitter. Tara let out a low whistle. "Holy shit." Ellis swallowed hard. "You're telling me those conspiracy nuts were right? Birds really aren't real?" She shrugged. "Not all birds, obviously, but this? Yeah, this is something else." Then she spotted something, a small logo etched onto one of the circuits, a stylized feather next to the letters FT. "Feather Tech," Tara read aloud. "Never heard of it." Ellis shook his head. "Well, we're about to." Hours later, Tara sat back, eyes wide. "Ellis, this goes deep." She turned the screen toward him. Government contracts, surveillance programs dating back decades. FeatherTech had started by developing robotic birds for espionage, but it had grown into something more. It wasn't just spying, it was controlling. They weren't just monitoring people, they were manipulating ecosystems, replacing real birds, tracking human behavior. Ellis's stomach churned. How could no one have noticed? Tara sighed. People don't question what they don't want to see. It's perfect camouflage. Who looks twice at a pigeon? But before they could act, a low hum filled the air. A black van pulled up outside. Men in suits stepped out. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. Ellis James and Tara Nguyen. Surrender the device immediately. Tara cursed. They must have tracked the signal. They ran. The chase was relentless. Drones buzzed overhead. Agents cut off every escape route. Desperate, they ducked into the abandoned subway tunnels beneath the city. There, in the dim light, they devised a plan. Break into FeatherTech's central server. Expose everything. They infiltrated the facility. Tara hacked security. Ellis moved through halls filled with cages, not of living birds, but their mechanical replacements. As alarms blared, they uploaded the files to a public server, but not without a price. Tara was captured. Her last words echoed in Ellis's ears as the agents closed in. Go. Finish it. Days later, the world exploded. News stations, protests, investigations. FeatherTech fell. The government scrambled to contain the fallout, and in the skies, something changed. Real birds, fragile, messy, alive, returned. But Ellis couldn't. He was a fugitive now. A ghost. Forever looking over his shoulder, waiting for the day they found him. Ellis had tried to save the world, or at least he had tried to save the birds. The mechanical ones, the ones that had started it all, had become his constant companions, whether he wanted them or not. The weight of the small metallic pigeon in his pack was more than just its physical burden. It was a reminder of the battle he had fought, the risks he had taken, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong, and of everything that still needed to be set right. Yet the questions never left him. They gnawed at the edges of his mind, refusing to be silenced. Had he really uncovered everything? Had he even scratched the surface? Or had he only exposed the tip of an iceberg so vast and so insidious that he couldn't even comprehend the full consequences of his actions? Days passed, and Ellis watched the world shift. The government had promised transparency. They had assured the public that the Feather program was dismantled. But whispers told a different story. New forms of surveillance, new methods of control. The fight wasn't over, not really. The shadow of Feather might have been lifted, but there were darker forces at play. Forces that had stayed hidden in the depths while he had been busy battling what he thought was the real enemy. And now, he could no longer ignore them. They had made him a fugitive. But the government wasn't the only one with secrets. There was something deeper, a network, a system that hadn't been exposed yet. Ellis could feel it pressing down on him like a weight, a silent hand gripping his chest. He knew one thing for certain: the battle was far from over. To escape the noise of the world, Ellis sought refuge in the wild places, places far from the cities and their watchful machines. He spent his days in the forests and wetlands, recording the songs of the real birds. They were louder now, freer. He liked to think they were reclaiming what had always been theirs, and yet the doubt never left him. Every time he spotted a pigeon perched on a power line or a seagull gliding overhead, the same question haunted him. Was it real? Or was it one of them? Had the mechanical birds truly been wiped out? Or had they simply gone deeper underground, hiding in plain sight? Some days, he thought he could tell the difference. The real ones moved with an effortless grace, an unpredictability that the machines never quite mastered. Other times, he wasn't so sure. A crow might cock its head just a fraction too precisely. A sparrow might follow him for miles, its gaze too sharp, too focused. One evening, by a quiet lake, he spotted a lone pigeon on the grass nearby. It cocked its head, watching him in a way that felt intentional. Ellis held his breath. "Are you here to watch me?" he murmured. The bird didn't answer. Of course it didn't. It simply fluffed its feathers and stared out at the water. Ellis let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. Maybe, real or mechanical, The birds were simply a part of the world now. And so was he. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Ellis leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the soft beating of wings in the distance. The sound reminded him of something his father had once said long ago. Birds are freedom. They don't belong to anyone. They just are. For the first time in years, Ellis let himself believe it. But the feeling didn't last. Just as the last light of the sun faded, that familiar unease crept back into his bones, coiling around his spine like a warning. He had felt this too many times since exposing Feather Tech. The government hadn't simply let go of its control. The so-called disappearance of the program had been a smokescreen, a distraction for the public, while something far worse took shape in the shadows. Ellis had uncovered the conspiracy, and in doing so, he had made himself the target. The first sign came days after that quiet night by the lake. He had taken shelter in a secluded mountain cabin, hoping for a brief reprieve from the paranoia that gnawed at him. But the world wasn't so easy to escape anymore. It started as a low hum, distant and barely audible, as if the air itself vibrated with something unnatural. Ellis stepped outside, scanning the treetops. The forest was still, too still. Then he saw it, a drone, no bigger than a sparrow, hovering just above the tree line. His stomach twisted. For a moment, it didn't seem to notice him. But then, as if sensing his gaze, it shifted. It darted off, into the night. Ellis's pulse thundered in his ears. They had found him, and they weren't going to stop. From that moment on, he was on the move, never staying in one place for long. He travelled from one remote hideout to another, his senses on high alert. At times, he thought he could hear the faint mechanical hum just beyond his perception. So quiet, so subtle, that he almost convinced himself it was his imagination. But deep down, he knew they were watching. The more he moved, the more certain he became. The government hadn't abandoned their bird surveillance program. They had refined it, perfected it. What had once been a mere fleet of robotic pigeons had evolved into something far more insidious. The birds weren't just watching anymore. They were hunting him. They had become tools of oppression. Silent predators in the sky, roaming the air, like ghosts, their sensors sweeping the streets below with unwavering precision. Ellis could feel them, an invisible weight pressing on his shoulders, a constant suffocating presence lurking just beyond his line of sight. Everywhere he went, they were there, perched on street lamps, gliding overhead, flitting through the trees in the park. Each rustle of wings felt like an accusation, every chirp a whispered warning. They had learned. The mechanical birds no longer looked artificial, no longer moved with the stiffness of early prototypes. They mimicked real birds so perfectly that they had become indistinguishable from their natural counterparts. To the untrained eye, they were nothing more than pigeons, sparrows, and crows. But Ellis knew better. There was no mistaking the cold, mechanical precision in their movements. They weren't just birds anymore. They were eyes, hundreds of them, watching, calculating, waiting. Ellis could feel their gaze trailing him, tracking him with a suffocating accuracy that made the very air feel hostile. But this wasn't just about surveillance anymore. The network had evolved. It was adapting. The birds weren't just spies. They were enforcers of a new order, an order unseen, unheard, and unstoppable. He had nowhere to run. Each time he thought he had slipped past them, they found him again. A flash of a camera lens behind the trees, an unmarked van idling too long, near a gas station. The walls of the world were closing in, and no matter how far he ran, they would always know where he was. It was only a matter of time. The realization hit him like a slow-moving vice, tightening around his chest. The birds weren't just tracking movements or recording conversations anymore. They were hunting him, and they were winning. Ellis had once revered these creatures. They had led him to the truth. But now, They had become the instruments of his undoing. He had exposed the lie, and now they were going to erase him. One night, deep in a valley far from civilization, he heard it, a rustling in the trees. Ellis froze, breath catching in his throat. The forest was still, too still. Then, movement. A bird silhouetted in the moonlight, hovering just above the tree line. Perfectly still. Too perfect. It wasn't real. Without hesitation, he grabbed his gear and bolted. The hum of the drone followed, growing louder, sharper. The pursuit wasn't just relentless, it was precise. Every move he made, the birds anticipated. They were always one step ahead. Panic clawed at his throat. They weren't just chasing him, they were leading him. The birds were simply a part of the world now. And so was he. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Ellis leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the soft beating of wings in the distance. The sound reminded him of something his father had once said long ago. Birds are freedom. They don't belong to anyone. They just are. For the first time in years, Ellis let himself believe it. But the feeling didn't last. Just as the last light of the sun faded, that familiar unease crept back into his bones, coiling around his spine like a warning. He had felt this too many times since exposing FeatherTech. The government hadn't simply let go of its control. The so-called disappearance of the program had been a smokescreen, a distraction for the public, while something far worse took shape in the shadows. Ellis had uncovered the conspiracy, and in doing so, he had made himself the target. The first sign came days after that quiet night by the lake. He had taken shelter in a secluded mountain cabin, hoping for a brief reprieve from the paranoia that gnawed at him. But the world wasn't so easy to escape anymore. It started as a low hum, distant and barely audible, as if the air itself vibrated with something unnatural. Ellis stepped outside, scanning the treetops. The forest was still, too still. Then he saw it. A drone, no bigger than a sparrow, hovering just above the tree line. His stomach twisted. For a moment, it didn't seem to notice him. But then, as if sensing his gaze, it shifted. It darted off, into the night. Ellis's pulse thundered in his ears. They had found him, and they weren't going to stop. From that moment on, he was on the move, never staying in one place for long. He traveled from one remote hideout to another, his senses on high alert. At times, he thought he could hear the faint mechanical hum just beyond his perception, so quiet, so subtle, that he almost convinced himself it was his imagination. But, deep down, he knew. They were watching. The more he moved, the more certain he became. The government hadn't abandoned their bird surveillance program. They had refined it, perfected it. What had once been a mere fleet of robotic pigeons had evolved into something far more insidious. The birds weren't just watching anymore, they were hunting him. They had become tools of oppression, silent predators in the sky, roaming the air, like ghosts, their sensors sweeping the streets below with unwavering precision. Ellis could feel them, an invisible weight pressing on his shoulders, a constant, suffocating presence lurking just beyond his line of sight. Everywhere he went, they were there, perched on street lamps, gliding overhead, flitting through the trees in the park. Each rustle of wings felt like an accusation, every chirp a whispered warning. They had learned. The mechanical birds no longer looked artificial, no longer moved with the stiffness of early prototypes. They mimicked real birds so perfectly that they had become indistinguishable from their natural counterparts. To the untrained eye, they were nothing more than pigeons, sparrows, and crows. But Ellis knew better. There was no mistaking the cold, mechanical precision in their movements. They weren't just birds anymore. They were eyes, hundreds of them, watching, calculating, waiting. Ellis could feel their gaze trailing him, tracking him with a suffocating accuracy that made the very air feel hostile. But this wasn't just about surveillance anymore. The network had evolved. It was adapting. The birds weren't just spies. They were enforcers of a new order, an order unseen, unheard, and unstoppable. He had nowhere to run. Each time he thought he had slipped past them, they found him again. A flash of a camera lens behind the trees, an unmarked van idling too long, near a gas station. The walls of the world were closing in, and no matter how far he ran, they would always know where he was. It was only a matter of time. The realization hit him like a slow-moving vice, tightening around his chest. The birds weren't just tracking movements or recording conversations anymore. They were hunting him, and they were winning. Ellis had once revered these creatures. They had led him to the truth, but now they had become the instruments of his undoing. He had exposed the lie, and now they were going to erase him. One night, deep in a valley far from civilization, he heard it. A rustling in the trees. Ellis froze, breath catching in his throat. The forest was still. Too still. Then, movement. A bird silhouetted in the moonlight, hovering just above the tree line. Perfectly still. Too perfect. It wasn't real. Without hesitation, he grabbed his gear and bolted. The hum of the drone followed, growing louder, sharper. The pursuit wasn't just relentless. It was precise. Every move he made, the birds anticipated. They were always one step ahead. Panic clawed at his throat. They weren't just chasing him. They were leading him.